The moment someone tells you that your voice does not matter is often the moment it matters most. 16-year-old Jalen Brooks did not know those words would define one of the most important days of his life. The morning sun reflected off the glass exterior of North Point Logistics as he stepped off the city bus and looked up at the massive corporate building rising above downtown Atlanta. It was his third week as a summer intern, and every day still felt unreal. Employees carrying coffee cups hurried through revolving doors while delivery trucks moved steadily through loading docks behind the building. Jalen adjusted the strap of his backpack and walked inside. Tucked safely in one of the pockets was a small red USB drive he carried almost everywhere. Most people would have considered it ordinary. Before long, it would become the most important object in the building. Jalen had worked hard to earn this internship. His mother often reminded him that opportunities were valuable, but preparation was even more valuable. He remembered those words every time he arrived before most employees and stayed later than expected. Unlike some interns who treated the position as a temporary experience, Jalen viewed it as a chance to learn how major companies actually operated. He paid attention to everything: inventory reports, shipping records, employee workflows, data dashboards. The more he learned, the more fascinated he became. Numbers told stories. Most people simply never took the time to listen. Inside the operations department, managers and analysts were already preparing for the quarterly performance review scheduled later that week. It was one of the most important meetings of the quarter. Regional leaders would attend. Department results would be evaluated. Promotions, bonuses, and future budgets could all be influenced by what happened in that conference room. At the center of it all stood Daniel Foster. Daniel managed the operations division and carried himself with the confidence of someone who expected success. Employees respected him. Some feared disappointing him. Others worked hard to earn his approval. Daniel was known for moving quickly and expecting others to do the same. He rarely tolerated mistakes and had little patience for questions he considered unnecessary. That morning, Jalen entered the department carrying a stack of reports requested by one of the analysts. As he walked past several desks, he noticed employees discussing the upcoming review. Performance numbers appeared strong. Delivery efficiency was reportedly improving. Inventory losses were reportedly decreasing. Everything seemed positive, yet something about the reports continued bothering him. During the previous week, Jalen had been helping organize shipment records. While comparing several databases, he noticed small inconsistencies. At first, they appeared insignificant. A missing timestamp here, a duplicated entry there. But after reviewing additional records, the pattern became harder to ignore. Certain inventory totals did not match corresponding shipment logs. Delivery numbers appeared stronger in summary reports than they did in detailed records. The differences were small individually. Together, they raised uncomfortable questions. Jalen sat at his workstation and opened another spreadsheet. Once again, the numbers refused to align. He checked the calculations twice, then 3 times. The result remained the same. Something was wrong. Around him, employees prepared for another busy day. Phones rang. Keyboards clicked. Conversations filled the office. Nobody seemed concerned. Nobody seemed aware. Jalen stared at the screen and felt a growing sense of responsibility. He was only an intern. Yet if the data was truly inaccurate, someone needed to say something. The decision he made next would place him on a path that would eventually challenge the most powerful person in his department and change far more than a quarterly report. The decision stayed with Jalen Brooks throughout the rest of the day. Every time he looked at another report, the same inconsistencies appeared. The numbers presented in summary dashboards did not fully match the detailed operational records stored throughout the system. Individually, the differences looked small enough to ignore. Together, they formed a pattern that became impossible to dismiss. Most interns would have stopped there. Jalen could not. After finishing his assigned tasks, he remained at his workstation while employees gradually left for the evening. The operations floor grew quieter as the sun lowered beyond the Atlanta skyline. Computer monitors illuminated rows of empty desks. Cleaning crews moved through distant hallways. Jalen opened another spreadsheet and compared shipment histories against inventory adjustments. Once again, the records told 2 different stories. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. Either he was missing something important, or the company was relying on inaccurate information. Neither possibility felt comfortable. The next morning, Jalen arrived early. He wanted fresh eyes on the problem. With a notebook beside his keyboard, he carefully documented every discrepancy he found. Some involved shipment quantities. Others involved warehouse inventory levels. A few involved delivery completion records. Nothing suggested intentional wrongdoing. But the reporting errors appeared widespread enough to affect important business decisions. Around mid-morning, one of the analysts named Rebecca stopped by his desk. She noticed the growing stack of notes beside his computer. "You look busy," she said with a smile. Jalen hesitated before answering. "Can I ask you something?" Rebecca nodded. Jalen explained several of the inconsistencies he had discovered. As she listened, her expression shifted from casual curiosity to mild concern. She reviewed a few of the reports herself. "That is strange," she admitted. "I have never looked at these records side by side." For a moment, Jalen felt encouraged. Maybe someone else saw what he was seeing. But Rebecca quickly glanced toward Daniel Foster's office. "You should probably bring this to management," she said carefully. "It is above my level." That answer stayed with Jalen for the rest of the afternoon. Bringing concerns directly to management felt intimidating. Daniel Foster was known for expecting efficiency and confidence. Interns rarely approached him without a specific assignment. Still, the quarterly review was only days away. If the data was inaccurate, leadership deserved to know before major decisions were made. Determined to be thorough, Jalen spent the next several hours organizing his findings. He created side-by-side comparisons. He highlighted discrepancies. He documented timestamps and report sources. Everything was saved onto the small red USB drive he carried in his backpack. By the time he finished, the evidence filled multiple files. Looking at the organized data gave him confidence. He was no longer relying on a feeling. He had facts. As employees prepared to leave for the evening, Jalen looked through the glass wall toward Daniel Foster's office. The manager was reviewing presentation materials for the upcoming executive meeting. Jalen knew he would eventually have to speak up. The numbers demanded it. What he did not know was that the conversation ahead would become far more difficult than he imagined. Because while evidence can reveal the truth, it cannot force someone to listen. The following afternoon, Jalen Brooks finally decided he could not wait any longer. The quarterly review was approaching quickly, and every new report he examined seemed to confirm the same troubling pattern. He checked his files one final time, organized the supporting documents, and copied the latest records onto the small red USB drive. Then he stood from his workstation and walked toward Daniel Foster's office. Each step felt heavier than the last. Through the glass wall, Daniel appeared busy reviewing presentation slides and performance summaries. Several framed awards hung behind his desk, reminders of years spent building a reputation for efficiency and results. Jalen paused briefly before knocking. Daniel glanced up. "Come in," he said without looking particularly interested. Jalen entered and carefully placed a folder on the desk. "Mr. Foster, I think I found something important in the shipment data." Daniel continued reading a document. "What kind of something?" Jalen explained the discrepancies he had discovered. He described inventory records that did not align with warehouse reports. He pointed out delivery numbers that appeared different depending on which system generated the report. He spoke calmly and respectfully, making sure every statement was supported by documentation. For a moment, Daniel remained silent. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at the folder. "You spent your time checking all of this?" he asked. "Yes, sir," Jalen replied. "I wanted to make sure I was not misunderstanding the data." Daniel opened the folder briefly. His eyes moved across a few pages before he closed it again. "Jalen, you are an intern." The words were not shouted. They did not need to be. These systems are reviewed by professionals every day. Jalen remained respectful. "I understand, sir. That is why I checked everything multiple times." Daniel sighed. "You are looking at information without understanding the bigger picture." Jalen tried again. "What if the reports being prepared for the quarterly review are incomplete?" Daniel's expression hardened slightly. "They are not." The conversation attracted the attention of several nearby employees. A few glanced toward the office through the glass walls. Daniel noticed them watching. "Listen carefully," he said. "One of the biggest mistakes young people make is assuming they have discovered a problem that experienced professionals somehow missed." Jalen felt his face grow warm. "I am not trying to challenge anyone," he said. "I just thought someone should know." Daniel stood and handed the folder back. "The matter is handled." Then came the sentence Jalen would remember long after the meeting ended. You are just an intern. Leave the real decisions to people who understand the business. A few employees outside the office exchanged uncomfortable looks. Nobody spoke. Jalen accepted the folder and quietly thanked him for his time. Then he left the office. Back at his desk, disappointment settled heavily over him. For several minutes, he stared at the computer screen without moving. Part of him wondered if he should simply let the matter go. Daniel had made his position clear. Yet every report remained unchanged. Every inconsistency remained unexplained. And as Jalen looked at the red USB drive resting beside his keyboard, he realized something important. Being ignored did not make the evidence disappear. For the rest of the afternoon, Jalen Brooks tried to focus on his assigned work, but Daniel Foster's words continued echoing in his mind. You are just an intern. Leave the real decisions to people who understand the business. Every time he looked at the reports on his screen, the sentence returned. It would have been easy to stop. Nobody expected an intern to challenge operational data. Nobody expected a 16-year-old student to question reports prepared by experienced managers. Yet the numbers still refused to make sense. Long after most employees left the office, Jalen remained at his workstation. The operations floor had grown quiet again. Only a handful of lights remained on. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, Atlanta's skyline shimmered against the evening sky. Jalen opened every file one more time. He compared warehouse records against shipment logs. He checked timestamps. He reviewed archived reports. The more information he gathered, the clearer the pattern became. The inconsistencies were not random. Certain adjustments repeatedly appeared just before performance summaries were generated. Inventory shortages seemed to disappear from one report and reappear elsewhere. Delivery statistics looked stronger in executive presentations than in supporting records. Jalen carefully documented every example. This time he did not focus only on the discrepancies themselves. He recorded where the information originated. He tracked dates. He identified which reports were affected and which systems contained conflicting data. Every discovery was organized into clearly labeled folders. He saved copies onto the small red USB drive resting beside his keyboard. The drive had become more than a storage device. It had become a record of everything nobody wanted to discuss. The following morning, employees arrived to find Jalen already working. Several co-workers greeted him politely. Rebecca stopped by again and noticed the growing collection of notes spread across his desk. You are still investigating this? She asked. Jalen nodded. I cannot ignore it. Rebecca looked concerned. After your conversation with Daniel, I would be careful. Jalen understood her warning. Daniel was respected throughout the department. Few employees openly challenged him. But Jalen was not trying to challenge anyone. He was trying to understand the truth. I am only documenting facts, he replied. Rebecca studied him for a moment before quietly saying, then make sure your facts are impossible to dismiss. Those words stayed with him throughout the day. By late afternoon, Jalen had assembled the strongest evidence yet. Detailed comparisons, original records, historical data, system logs. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion. The performance numbers scheduled for presentation during the quarterly review did not tell the complete story. Whether the errors were intentional or accidental, leadership deserved to see the full picture before making important decisions. As the office prepared for the upcoming executive meeting, excitement spread through the department. Managers finalized presentations. Analysts prepared summaries. Daniel Foster appeared more confident than ever. Rumors circulated that his division was expected to receive special recognition for outstanding results. Employees congratulated one another in advance. Yet while everyone else focused on celebration, Jalen focused on preparation. Before leaving for the evening, he copied every file onto the red USB one final time and placed it securely inside his backpack. Then he looked toward the large conference room where the quarterly review would soon take place. For the first time, he realized that the evidence he carried might eventually be seen by far more people than Daniel Foster. The morning of the quarterly review arrived with an energy that felt different from every other day. Employees moved through the halls carrying laptops, presentation folders, and coffee cups as final preparations unfolded throughout the building. Conference rooms were booked. Presentation screens were tested. Department leaders reviewed talking points one last time. For most employees, the meeting represented another routine business event. For Jalen Brooks, it felt like a turning point. He arrived earlier than usual and took a moment to look across the operations floor. Everything appeared normal. Yet inside his backpack rested the small red USB drive containing weeks of research, comparisons, and supporting records. The evidence had not changed. The questions had not disappeared. If anything, they felt even more important now. Throughout the morning, Daniel Foster moved through the department with visible confidence. Employees congratulated him in advance. Several supervisors spoke openly about the strong performance numbers expected to be presented. Rumors continued circulating that upper leadership was particularly impressed with the division's recent results. Daniel accepted the praise naturally. He smiled often. He appeared relaxed. Watching from his workstation, Jalen wondered whether Daniel truly believed every number in the report or whether he simply trusted the summaries placed in front of him. Either way, the outcome remained the same. The discrepancies still existed. Shortly before noon, employees began gathering near the executive conference suite. Senior managers arrived from other divisions. Regional leaders entered carrying briefing materials. The atmosphere felt professional but celebratory. Through the glass walls of the conference room, Jalen could see rows of seats surrounding a long polished table. Large presentation screens covered one wall. At the center sat a reserved place for Margaret Collins, the regional director responsible for overseeing multiple facilities across the region. Margaret had earned a reputation for fairness and attention to detail. People respected her because she listened before making decisions. As attendees found their seats, Jalen remained near the back of the room. Interns rarely spoke during meetings of this level. Their role was usually to observe and learn. That expectation suited him perfectly. He had no intention of creating a scene. He simply wanted leadership to have access to the facts if the opportunity ever appeared. The meeting began precisely on schedule. One department after another presented updates. Financial summaries appeared on giant screens. Operational achievements were highlighted. Productivity metrics received praise. Several executives congratulated teams for exceeding expectations. Then Daniel Foster stood and approached the front of the room. A confident smile crossed his face as his presentation appeared behind him. Charts showed strong inventory control. Delivery performance looked excellent. Efficiency metrics exceeded projections. As Daniel explained each slide, several leaders nodded approvingly. Some even took notes. The atmosphere became increasingly positive. By the time he finished, the room responded with polite applause. One executive praised the department's performance. Another called the results impressive. Daniel thanked them and returned to his seat, looking satisfied. Jalen felt his stomach tighten. The presentation on the screen reflected the same reports he had questioned for weeks. The same reports containing inconsistencies. The same reports Daniel had dismissed without investigation. Around the room, people prepared to move on to the next agenda item. Everything seemed ready to conclude exactly as expected. Then Margaret Collins glanced down at her notes, paused thoughtfully, and asked a simple question that immediately changed the direction of the meeting. "Before we continue," she said, looking across the room, "does anyone have information that has not yet been presented today?" Margaret Collins's question lingered in the room for several seconds. Most people expected silence. Department presentations were finished. The agenda was nearly complete. Executives glanced toward one another, waiting for the meeting to continue. Then, from near the back of the room, a chair moved quietly. Jalen Brooks stood up. Several heads turned immediately. Some employees looked surprised. Others looked confused. Daniel Foster looked annoyed. The room had spent the past hour discussing executive performance metrics. Nobody expected an intern to speak. Jalen felt dozens of eyes watching him, but he remained calm. Weeks of preparation had brought him to this moment. Margaret noticed him standing. "Yes?" she asked politely. Jalen swallowed once before answering. "I believe there is additional information related to the operations report." The room became noticeably quieter. Daniel leaned forward. "Margaret, this is unnecessary," he said. "The matter has already been reviewed." Jalen recognized the same tone he had heard inside Daniel's office days earlier. Margaret glanced between them. "Has the information been presented?" she asked. Daniel hesitated. "Not exactly." Margaret nodded. "Then I would like to hear it." Several executives shifted in their seats. Curiosity was beginning to replace routine. Jalen walked carefully toward the front of the conference room. The red USB drive rested in his hand. It suddenly felt heavier than it actually was. Reaching the presentation computer, he paused briefly before connecting it. The large screen behind him still displayed Daniel's final slide celebrating strong operational performance. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Jalen opened the first file. The screen changed. Colorful presentation graphics disappeared. Detailed operational records appeared in their place. Rows of shipment data filled the display. Inventory adjustments, warehouse reports, delivery logs, timestamps, source records, side-by-side comparisons. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Executives who had looked distracted moments earlier sat upright. Several leaned closer to the screen. Margaret narrowed her eyes as she reviewed the information. Jalen began explaining the discrepancies. He spoke clearly and respectfully. Every statement was supported by documentation. He showed where shipment totals differed between systems. He demonstrated how inventory losses appeared in one report but disappeared from another. He identified patterns that repeated over multiple reporting periods. Nobody interrupted. The room listened. Daniel's expression slowly changed. The confidence he displayed throughout the meeting began fading. One executive raised a hand. "Are these company records?" Jalen answered immediately. "Yes, sir. Every file came directly from our reporting systems." Another executive asked, "Have these discrepancies been verified?" Jalen opened additional documents. "I compared each record multiple times using independent system exports." Margaret studied the screen carefully. "Show me the timeline comparisons." Jalen clicked another file. New charts appeared. Several people exchanged concerned looks. The evidence was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. What had started as a simple question was transforming into something much larger. Daniel remained silent. For the first time since the meeting began, he seemed unsure what to say. Around the room, executives stopped looking at Jalen as an intern and started looking at him as the person presenting the most important information of the day. Then Margaret pointed toward a highlighted section of the screen and asked a question that caused the entire room to freeze. Who knew these discrepancies existed before today's meeting? Margaret Collins's question seemed to remove every remaining sound from the conference room. Who knew these discrepancies existed before today's meeting? For several seconds, nobody answered. Executives stared at the screen. Managers looked down at printed reports. The colorful performance charts that had impressed everyone earlier now seemed insignificant compared to the detailed records displayed behind Jalen Brooks. Standing at the front of the room, Jalen felt his heart beating faster, but he remained composed. He had not come to accuse anyone. He had only come to present facts. Margaret continued studying the highlighted data. "This information did not appear in the executive summary," she said. One of the senior directors nodded. "Neither did these inventory adjustments." Another executive pointed toward a section of the report. "And these shipment discrepancies affect multiple facilities." The room was beginning to see the full picture. Questions emerged from every direction. How long had the inconsistencies existed? Why were certain figures different across reporting systems? Why had nobody raised concerns sooner? The atmosphere changed with every passing minute. Earlier, Daniel Foster had stood before the room receiving praise. Now attention had shifted completely. The discussion was no longer about performance. It was about accuracy. Daniel finally cleared his throat. "I think we need to be careful before drawing conclusions," he said. His voice remained professional, but the confidence that had filled his presentation was noticeably weaker. Large reporting systems often contain minor inconsistencies. Margaret nodded. "That is true." Then she looked back at the screen. "But these do not appear minor." Several executives agreed. One manager who had remained silent throughout the meeting spoke for the first time. "The intern's analysis appears thorough." Another executive added, "Very thorough." Hearing those words surprised Jalen. Just days earlier, he had struggled to convince anyone to review the data. Now leaders throughout the company were taking his findings seriously. Daniel shifted in his chair. "There may be explanations we have not considered." "Then we should examine them," Margaret replied calmly. Nobody disagreed. The room's attitude toward Jalen continued changing. Executives who barely noticed him when the meeting began now directed questions toward him instead of Daniel. They asked about his methodology. They asked how he discovered the discrepancies. They asked how long he had been reviewing the records. Jalen answered each question honestly and respectfully. He explained how he compared reports from different systems. He described the verification process. He showed the supporting documentation stored within the files. Every answer strengthened his credibility. Across the room, several employees exchanged quiet looks of surprise. Some remembered seeing Jalen working late. Others remembered the folder he carried into Daniel's office. Suddenly, those moments seemed more significant. Then Rebecca spoke up from her seat near the middle of the room. I remember Jalen bringing concerns forward several days ago. The statement immediately drew attention. Daniel looked toward her. Rebecca continued carefully. He showed me some of the discrepancies before this meeting. The room became quiet again. Margaret looked directly at Daniel. Several days ago, she asked. Daniel hesitated. It was only a brief pause, but everyone noticed. The pause mattered because it suggested something larger than reporting errors. It suggested that an opportunity to investigate had existed before today. Around the conference table, expressions changed. People were no longer evaluating data alone. They were evaluating decisions. And for the first time since Jalen connected the red USB drive to the presentation computer, Daniel appeared to realize that the most difficult questions were still ahead. The conference room remained unusually quiet after Rebecca's statement. Several days ago, those 3 words seemed to change the entire direction of the discussion. Until that moment, executives had been focused primarily on the reporting discrepancies. Now a new question had emerged. If concerns had been raised before the meeting, why had they not been investigated? Margaret Collins folded her hands on the table and looked directly at Daniel Foster. Her expression remained calm, but everyone in the room understood the seriousness of the moment. Did Jalen bring these findings to your attention before today? She asked. Daniel adjusted his posture. He approached me with concerns, he answered carefully. But the information appeared incomplete. Margaret nodded slightly. Did you review the supporting documents? Daniel hesitated again. This time the pause lasted longer. I reviewed portions of them. Around the room, executives exchanged looks. Nobody interrupted. Margaret turned toward Jalen. How much documentation did you provide? Jalen answered honestly. Everything I had verified at the time. He kept his voice respectful. He was not interested in embarrassing anyone. He simply wanted the facts to be clear. Margaret looked back at Daniel. And after reviewing those materials, no additional investigation was initiated? Daniel shifted in his chair. The department was preparing for the quarterly review. We were focused on higher-level priorities. The answer seemed to create even more concern. One senior executive leaned forward. Accurate reporting is a high-level priority. Several people nodded immediately. Another director added, particularly before presenting results to leadership. The atmosphere felt completely different from the beginning of the meeting. Earlier, Daniel had controlled the room. Now he was answering questions from it. Meanwhile, Jalen remained standing beside the presentation screen. The attention he was receiving still felt strange. Only a few days earlier, he had struggled to convince anyone to review his findings. Now senior leaders were discussing the importance of his work. Margaret turned toward the screen once more. Jalen, continue. He opened another folder stored on the red USB drive. New information appeared. Historical records filled the display. Timelines. Reporting changes. System comparisons. Supporting documentation. The room became even quieter. One executive removed his glasses and studied the screen carefully. Another opened a notebook and began writing observations. Margaret reviewed several pages before asking another question. How long did it take you to assemble this? About 2 weeks, Jalen replied. The answer surprised several people. 2 weeks. An intern had spent 2 weeks carefully documenting a problem that nobody else had addressed. The realization was difficult to ignore. Then Margaret asked the question that changed everything. Why did you continue after your concerns were dismissed? Jalen thought for a moment before answering. Because the data did not change. The simplicity of the response seemed to affect the room. He was not motivated by recognition. He was not trying to prove anyone wrong. He had simply continued because the facts remained the same. For a brief moment, nobody spoke. Then one executive quietly said, "That is exactly what we expect from responsible leadership." The words hung in the air. Several heads nodded. Daniel looked down at the table. Across the room, people were no longer discussing whether Jalen's findings were valid. That question had already been answered. They were discussing something much larger. They were discussing judgment, accountability, and the responsibility to listen. And as the conversation continued, it became increasingly clear that the most important lesson from the meeting had nothing to do with spreadsheets or inventory reports. The meeting continued for nearly another hour, but the outcome had already begun to take shape. The discussion was no longer centered on quarterly achievements or department rankings. It was centered on responsibility. Margaret Collins requested that the reporting discrepancies be formally reviewed by an independent audit team. Multiple executives agreed immediately. The recommendation was approved before anyone left the room. As the final action items were recorded, employees slowly began gathering their materials. Yet nobody seemed eager to leave. Something important had happened, and everyone knew it. Jalen Brooks remained near the presentation screen, still holding the small red USB drive that had changed the direction of the entire meeting. He looked around the room and noticed something unfamiliar. The same people who barely acknowledged him at the beginning of the meeting were now approaching him with questions, compliments, and words of appreciation. One executive thanked him for his attention to detail. Another praised his professionalism. A senior director shook his hand and said that integrity could not be taught as easily as technical skills. Jalen accepted each comment politely. He felt grateful, but he also felt relieved. More than anything else, he was glad the information had finally been examined. Across the room, Daniel Foster remained seated for several moments after most people stood. His presentation materials were still open on the table in front of him. The confidence that had defined his morning was gone, replaced by quiet reflection. Eventually, he rose from his chair and walked toward Jalen. Several nearby employees noticed immediately. The room seemed to grow quieter once again. Daniel stopped a few feet away. For a moment, neither person spoke. Then Daniel looked directly at the teenager he had dismissed only days earlier. "I should have listened," he said. The words were simple. There were no excuses attached to them. No attempts to redirect blame. Just a straightforward acknowledgement. Jalen nodded respectfully. "I only wanted the reports to be accurate." Daniel looked at the red USB drive and then back at Jalen. "I know that now." The conversation lasted less than a minute, but many people would remember it long afterward. Because in that moment, the issue was no longer about data. It was about humility. It was about recognizing value regardless of title, age, or position. As employees began leaving the conference room, Margaret Collins approached Jalen. "Walk with me," she said. Together they stepped into the hallway overlooking the city below. Margaret paused near the windows. "You demonstrated something important today," she said. "Not just technical ability. Persistence, professionalism, judgment." Jalen listened carefully. "Thank you." Margaret smiled. "What are your plans after graduation?" The question caught him by surprise. He explained his goals, his interest in business analytics, and his hope of building a career in operations management someday. Margaret listened closely. Then she handed him a business card. "When the time comes, contact me directly." Jalen looked at the card and then back at her. "Really?" Margaret nodded. People who stay committed to the truth when nobody is listening are rare. Companies need more of them. Later that evening, as Jalen left the building and stepped into the warm Atlanta air, the city lights reflected across the glass towers around him. The red USB drive remained safely in his pocket. It looked exactly the same as it had weeks earlier. Yet everything around it had changed. Because the greatest lesson from that day was not that evidence can reveal the truth. It was that every voice deserves to be heard before someone decides it does not matter.